Good evening. This is November 30, 2021 in Tucker, Georgia. I'm Dick Darnall, and we're going to have a short discussion on what is the idea and origin that led to the internet originally in thought and historical moment. I think it was around 1961, 61, what have you, when this conference in Philadelphia took place. Tell us about that, Lane.
Well, let me set the scene a little bit. Bob had been in the Navy and gone to the reserve, and every year the reserve had to have a week that they went and got together. So he was part of the mobilization system. They had a conference in Philadelphia. They'd been there for 2 weeks. Everybody was ready to go home. Bob, they were an auditorium full of master sergeants, and everybody said, let's go home. But the moderator said, does anybody have anything else to add? And this brash young guy stood up and said, I have something to say. And he looked around, and everybody looked at him and glared. And he said he was concerned with the fact that if you're going to mobilize people, need to be able to communicate with them. Mm-hmm. And so if you had like something the other side of the Mississippi River, and the telephone lines broke, how did you get the message across? And Bob, what did you say when he finally got it together?
We must be able to launch a message into a cloud, not knowing the path by which it travels, but only its destination.
And so that was the idea. In other words, not to just depend on the linear thing, but to be able to put the messages out. And later on, Bob was instrumental in the computers have to be able to link back up together. And so he was able to develop a system by which they could find each other and link back up again. And I believe he tells me that he was in a conference at one time and they were debating this, some of the different companies were debating about it. And Bob could have easily had the patent on that. But just like with mass production of a rifle, if everybody makes their own individual part, then you can't duplicate it. So he said, I put this in the public domain so that the system would work. So that was the beginning of the idea that led to the internet.
And that was in sense of direction of relationship of some of the universities with the military. Was Bob involved with the theory concept of BOD, for BOD technology of conducting that transmission and communication? Or was it something else that was the framework base for that communication to take place? What do you remember? He's 85 and we're going to make this happen.
Well, at that point, Bob he just put the idea out there and the Navy kind of looked at that and said, well, we got to do something with it. And I don't know later, because he programmed his first computer in 1959. He was going to Drexel and on a work-study program and working for big industrial engines at Westinghouse. And that he did languages like Snowball. So he was programming at that point. But that he actually worked, he's not claiming that he actually worked on the initial development of this. He's saying that it was his idea that got implemented.
I see. And thus, that is the source point in beginning in thought. I imagine at the conference when he stood up and said that the crowd of sergeants would have you sort of fell silent for a moment, like, yeah.
Well, actually, they went growl, shut up.
Because they wanted to get out of there.
They were tired and weary, and the conference had been going on long enough, and they didn't want to stay another minute.
Was this in a hotel offhand, or where would you say?
I'd say it was in the workroom alongside of the hotels.
in town? I see. And a period of time took place from that conference and idea where implementation took place. Would that be like 3 months after that time? Or what would be said? Because the military can be very quick when they get on a sense of direction.
You think so, huh?
Well, they can be very slow also. You know.
You got that one right this time.
Yeah. What happened?
Well, somebody got the idea that it was a good idea. And that was someone up the spiral.
Was it military intel or both?
Military.
Okay.
We must be able to launch a message into a cloud, not knowing the path by which it travels, but only its destination.
Ooh. And what approach in theory struck to mind that led you to that thought to take place?
I think that a thought like that comes because Bob was thinking strategically about how do you communicate, and it just molded. It came to him in his mind at some point that the system that we had was not working, and we needed a different kind of system, and he imagined what that should be, and then he spoke that.
And we had to have cooperation of all hands. Think about that for a moment. Oops.
Whoops. Yeah. That's something we can't talk about on this video. Not he or I.
It still can't be talked about. How many years?
50 years, I guess, from then. Or is it 70? You know, what do we got? Oh, no, it's 60. So the next thing, we're getting there, aren't we? So I understand from past conversations that you went to Ohio to be involved with several projects of thought and research, and one of which involved a further execution of the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I understand a circumstance took place. Bob likes to make tea. He's not been a coffee drinker. He's a tea guy.
Certainly, yes.
Forever, which is far out. And do you have a preference of tea? Is it Earl Grey or do you move around?
Earl Grey is good.
But constant comment is your thing.
You're right.
Oh, okay. And that you were going down the hallway, to my understanding, and there was some generals in the hallway, what have you, and they were kind of talking about this circumstance, what have you, and you are a given flavor of need, and you kind of interrupted because you wanted to get through them to get to the hot water bottle, or what have you, the commissary room, and you said something to them. They fell silent, looked at each other, turned 4 ways, and walked away. Thus, you were able to go down to the room. Do you remember that setting offhand? Or similar?
Now that you put it together in words, yeah. But I'd lost it for many years.
To my understanding from our conversation 35 years ago on this point, that they were wanting to have a communication in research with colleges and themselves. And so the idea was enhanced upon as he was going down the hallway. It was already in motion from the results of the conference, but, everything was just analog landline then.
At some later point, Bob was working with computers, and they had to be able to join the as we said, make the information come back and coalesce in the right order. And Bob figured out a way to do that. And I said, did I say this already? That he figured out how to do it, and a bunch of people were around, and they said, well, that's a proprietary thing. That can make you a lot of money. But Bob said, unless we standardize it and make it available to everybody, it's not going to work. And so he did not take the proprietary rights on that linkage. So that happened at some point. I'm not sure when that happened, but
early.
But then about 10 years later, when Bob was up working with Bell's labs up in Cleveland, Ohio, I came up for Christmas, and he was real proud because he said, the factory and the offices were over here, and we were the other side of the expressway. And in the apartment he rented, he said, now I'm going to send a message to my workplace, or from my workplace to this thing, but I'm going to route it through California and Washington and Texas and all over, and then it's going to come here. So he was part of that, how to route the ideas around in different ways. But one of the things that they offered him, they had a problem, and that was this probably around 1974 or 5, beginning to have satellites, and the satellites were sending information, and the information was coming down, but they couldn't get it to work. And so they were having this great, huge problem, and Bob was a consultant at that point, and they said, well, you've got all sorts of good ideas. We'll offer you a job in New Jersey. And then he said, the thing you need to do is to sync it to Greenwich Mean Time. And all the satellites be on Greenwich Mean Time, and then they would close. And they went and thought about that. They went, they did it, and came back and said, oh, we don't need you in New Jersey anymore. But
did you again. They did you again.
But the idea, see, he's the idea man. He comes up with these inspirations that spark things. They were having a problem with all the data that was coming in from the satellites. And there was nothing, they just couldn't get things to work together. Because things have to be timed correctly for things to link up. You've got to have real time there. And the problem is that information would come from this satellite, and then they tried to link it up, and they said, how can we do this? How can we get it to link up? And so Bob said, being a Navy man, why don't we use Greenwich Mean Time? Put all the satellites are the same as Greenwich Mean Time there in England, using the same time, and if they're all using the same clock and the same time, then the data will sync. So this was how you deal with data in real time.
I see. And was that need in cause for where computers, per se, because the first days of computers were toggle switches and a glorified abacus at the same
and diode bulbs.
And
yes.
diode bulbs,
yes.
That's true. And before the Russians made all the tubes, but that's another story. Which good for them. And they make great tubes. Point in being question then, would that need in synchronization through the time, certainly with Greenwich Mean, also inspire the need for timering to be involved with computers, per se? Not in a stopwatch fashion, but in a ascription to the 24-hour clock, whether military or the other end of it. And did that lead to that? What do you say on that, Bob? That you did. You did. He inspired the clock factor to
I know when he's up in Ohio in a different time. He was working on process control and the flow of fluids into tanks and out of tanks and how they measured that. And time was important to that. But as far as how time relates to computer, that's beyond me. So,
did that consultancy with success give others the idea that it was necessary for computers, at the time it was just mainframes, to be of a timer-based operation, working off of a clock?
Well, what you're saying is intuitively obvious to the most casual observer.
Mm-hmm. And you were able to affect a domino passing on of the need and approach to all of that, to computering.
well, I remember, as you say, they dealt in mainframes, and they had the great, huge computers, and he worked for Control Data for a while with their 6400, which was a mammoth machine. The Russians called up IBM and asked for the 6400. And of course, they didn't get it, but there was a component of the computer community that believed in these huge mainframes. But Bob saw early on that personal computers in many different locations can be networked into a system and work and spread the computing out, sort of similar to the internet, where you can use the different stations. So he was a proponent for developing of the individual stations a lot in different locations. A lot of people were, but he was not one of this, we got to have our great big machine. We got to have little ones that work together.
So he was a source of those ideas.
No, I wouldn't say he was a source. He just adhered to those ideas.
Okay, on that point. Okay, but GPS-wise, their base of operations, timing-wise, Bob was able to strike to mine and affect the institution of. Okay, well, that's what we need to know about the GPS factor. Did you have an understanding, Bob, of how the satellites worked per se as a machine at the time? Not now.
Well, yes. I understood the passage of time and distance. So that what starts on one side of the globe, I use globe in this sense to describe the overall, of which everything is coordinated.
I think he's saying that the problem that they were having, if I sort of remember this now, is the one satellite would talk to the next satellite, would talk to the next satellite, would talk to the next satellite, would talk to, by the time it got around, you'd lost time and you'd lost the coat, so things didn't work because, as he said, the time and the distance. Whereas if you have everybody using the same system, then they can coordinate that better. So that was the problem, that the satellites were going one to the other, and by the time it got around the globe, they'd lost it.
Wow, I see.
What she said.
He explained that to me then. Beginning in '66. Bob was working, when I first met him, for the University of Pennsylvania, and he took me on a date one time, and I key punched my French medieval novel, into cards while he was working on the computer. So he taught me how to do the basic key punching things. But he did statistics for doctors, and he was getting paid on the university scale where they expected grad students to work for forever for nothing, so he decided to branch out, and he took a job with Hahnemann Medical College as a statistician for their drug studies and their doctors. And so he moved on to a salaried position that, as a newlywed, he needed to do that. So they did studies on nicotine and how potent it was, and they did all of the statistics for the doctors that validated the research they were doing. But he would talk to the doctors, and they had this one problem patient. It was a 13, 14-year-old girl who was morbidly obese. And she was pregnant, and they could not, for the life of them, tell what was going on inside her to be able to help her. And Bob was discussing with the doctors, and he remembered having watched on television, National Geographic or some special, where the little fishes were swimming by the sonar, and it didn't seem to bother them at all. So he said, "Why don't we try sonar?" As he talked to the doctors, and they said, "Well, that sounds reasonable." So everybody went down to the Army-Navy store and picked up an old sonar machine, and Bob could say he remembers the swinging doors going back and forth, and the two doctors with this heavy sonar machine between the two of them strolling down the hallway to try it out. And they tried it out on a little dog that was pregnant, and it didn't hurt the dog, so they tried it on the girl, and they were able to visualize what was going on. And so I firmly believe that was the first use of ultrasound for medical treatments in this country. And maybe somebody else came up with the other idea another time, but I know that Bob came up with it then. And that would have been about 66, 67. Now we go, and every time we go for an ultrasound, I have to tell the story to the technician that Bob was responsible for their having that kind of a job. The other thing that you see when you go to the doctor's offices these days are the electronic medical records. And now everybody has everything on the computer, increasingly. But I can tell you there was a lot of resistance to that. Bob thought early on you ought to be able to computerize the records so that they could be shared. And he was a proponent for that and worked on that and got shot down on that lots of times. So, but that's just a story, just one story.
Shot down because of the sharing capability, or
no, because it's beyond. I remember
the privacy issues.
No, we were. I don't know whether I can say this or not, but we were involved with Amway for a while, and they have a system that needs documentation and bookkeeping, and Bob got this neat bookkeeping situation that would track what we needed to track. And the people above us said, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't do that because not everybody can do it. And it has to be duplicatable by everybody. And so this is just not a viable thing." And with the medical records, they would say, "Oh, this is too sophisticated. It demands too much equipment. This demands too much. It's not a viable thing." So early on, there was a resistance to it because they didn't think people would adopt it.
I see. But later
right?
they did. Later they did.
They still are doing it, and they're making it better and better.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay. Well,
in fact, I'll tell you one more thing. We went to LabCorp and had a test done. When we got there, you put your driver's license face down in the machine. It knew immediately all the information from the last time we were there. So it didn't have to re-enter any of this. So that this automation can just facilitate things happening. It's not a privacy issue because they're going to ask you the information again, and they're going to ask you information again and again and again. And every time you spend 15 to 20 minutes putting it again and again. But because of the type of automation people are using now, using computers, you can facilitate things happening quickly. And Bob was a proponent of medical records being available to any doctor with the punch of a button. And he worked for that long years ago.
Well, that's a fascinating contribution that has just been brought to light, as well as the subject of this short video on ultrasound
Right.
applications.
Now, let me be clear. I think that the ultrasound idea was sparked by Bob. That was it. The medical records, that was general. That was in the air, and he was working in that ambience at the time.